All right, y'all. We are at conversation 4 of 4 at the Self Black Men's Emotional Wellness Symposium. This is the first Self Black Men's Emotional Wellness Symposium, second of symposiums. I'm here today with Mike Joseph. I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and then we'll just segue into the conversation. And FYI, I have not followed the script for any of these conversations. After the intro, I just been like, oh, you said this thing. Let's talk about that. And that's just kind of trickled in and let the conversation flow. So go ahead, introduce yourself, my man. And as I can't feel that. I forgot I was supposed to ask you to unmute. There we
All
go.
good. All good. Can you hear me okay? Cool. First of all, Courtney, thank you for having me. I really appreciate you bringing me onto this, and I appreciate you holding this space for the people that are here. My name is Mike Joseph, born and raised and based in Brooklyn, New York. I am a lot of different things. Probably most pertinent to this particular conversation, I am a life and relationship coach. I host a podcast called Detoxicity, which is about detoxifying masculinity. I've done the podcast now for 5 years almost, since the beginning of 2020, interviewed over 180 people. It's part of, the larger work I do around mental health. Um, I do a fair amount of public speaking, panels, all sorts of different stuff. And that's kind of the broad scope of what I do. We can get more into it as we continue talking.
Yeah, man. So talk to me about the Detoxicity podcast. Like, I'm very curious about like just giving people that because it's also a resource they can go to and check out after. So
Mhm.
let's know, like, what are some of the conversations that you having on there?
I mean, the conversation is really tailored to who I'm speaking to. With my guests, I always try to get a little snapshot of what they're about, things that are important to them. So we've had conversations about everything from, losing a parent, losing a child, growing up in religious restrictive environments, discovering alternative sexualities later in life, divorce, like pretty much every topic that can be covered at this point, I think we've covered. um which is crazy because there's so many variations on each one of those things that we can do. Like this, I feel like 5 years in, we're just scratching the surface of the things that we can talk about.
Yeah, awesome, man. And so I guess I want to start out with in the conversations that you've had. So the Black Men's Emotional Wellness Symposium is deconstructing the high value man. So if you got to be familiar with like the Red Pill YouTube content out there, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
I'm curious to know what you've seen expressed as a high value man and then like what you've come through your own life experience learned for that to be.
I mean, there are so many things that are attached to being a high value man. And I think for me, ultimately, it boils down to personal integrity. It's about, what your moral code is and, how you live up to it, how you show up for yourself and the people that you love every single day. It's not necessarily a financial thing. It's not necessarily a anything other than just like when you get up in the morning, what is your purpose? What are you doing? Who are you doing it for? Are you doing things in a way that when you are laying on your deathbed, which is hopefully a long, long time from now, are you going to be like, I lived the best possible life I could, and I was good to people, and I treated myself well, I treated my body well, I treated other people well, I lived with courage, I lived with integrity, I lived with empathy, I lived with all of these things. Like it's you can't place a tangible value on what being a high value man is. A lot of it is, what are you adhering to internally?
And how much of that, like what we're adhering into or what we're adhering to internally, how much of that in fact impacts our outside world and the world around us, right? So as we talk about this, what's your code, what's your values, what's your purpose? I said this earlier, I don't know if you were in here, but I did like a Instagram post asking people what makes a man high value, and so many of the responses were first off from women saying he does this for me, it's what is done for me. And we talked a little bit about this in the other talks where it's not that, but having had conversations for at least 5 years with the podcast, I'm curious to what you've seen like develop from what we think high value is to what it is, or what, oh, hold on, there go my hands. All right. What high value was 5 years ago versus what it is now. Can you speak a little bit to the evolution of that, if you can, or if that makes sense as a question?
It makes sense. I think we need to back up off of the other people part of that equation. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know, if you ask somebody else how I'm supposed to act towards them, they're going to answer in a way that benefits them. That is human nature. But the bottom line is you got to benefit yourself. You got to look out for yourself. You got to put yourself first. You got to be number one. And I know in at least American culture, the idea is always that you are at your best when you are providing for other people. But I think when a lot of people try to provide for other people, they lose themselves in the process. And I'm not saying you shouldn't provide for other people. Like it's important to live your life at least somewhat in service to others. But the bottom line, and again, I hate to be super morbid about this shit, but when you're on your deathbed, ain't nobody going with you. You have to live with your decisions, and you have to live with the decisions that you made for yourself. Nobody's going to do anything for you that you can't do yourself. Like you have to look out for number one. Like people think about selfishness like it's a bad word. It's not a bad word. Like the best thing you can do for yourself is be selfish. Now, there's a negative connotation applied to that, and I'm not saying be that kind of selfish, but look out for yourself first, I think is ultimately you know, what it should all be about. Not look out for yourself at the expense of other people, but look out for yourself before you look out for other people, while also
Yeah.
including other people.
All right. So this sounds very much like self-care. And as a man, black man, I don't think that I really came into this concept of self care until I found myself in like more white spaces, right? And even then, it was like self care is I'm gonna run a bubble bath, I'm gonna light this candle. Like that shit don't appeal to me, right? So when we talk about taking care of yourself and that component of self care, what does prioritizing yourself look like for a black man, especially one who might have been told, oh, don't be selfish, right? Taking care of yourself or doing what you want to do for yourself is like the most selfish thing you can do, because we might battle those beliefs. While that's the best thing we can do for us, we've been taught that this is the worst thing that you could ever do.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I grew up thinking or being taught that selfishness was like the worst possible thing you could be. Like again, like I said before, it always had this like negative connotation to it. Um, but being selfish means going to the doctor. It means, if you determine that you need therapy, it means calling up, a therapist and making an appointment. It means doing for yourself. It means eating healthy. It means working out. It means, you know, um, not settling for shitty relationships. It means not putting negative media in your, not making negative media part of your diet. It means, all of these things that will, you know, that are very simple base level things you can do to make yourself happy and allow yourself to run as a better human being. Just again, like looking out for yourself, taking in the simplest form is taking care of yourself.
Ooh, all right. Now, as we do that though, right? So we see I have this experience where taking care of myself is a threat to someone else who depends on me not taking care of myself. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
All right. So in this, like, I see this play out in two ways. I see like my dad and my mom split. I never knew the story, but the narrative to me as a kid was, all right, well, my dad did what was best for him, I guess, or my mom did what was best for her, in that the relationship just ended. Like for whatever reason, they just weren't together. So this is them doing what's best for them. And the other person's like quality of life, I don't know, I'm using this as an example, but if one person is dependent on you not being your best self, right? And that is what the other person needs. With that being such a threat, like, what do we do to combat those inner voices or beliefs that we have about ourselves as people who maybe haven't taken care of ourselves, who are now maybe wanting to? Because it's so hard to get out of the habit of people pleasing. Oh, that's the word I was looking for. That's why I'm
Hmm.
stopping and shit. If we get out of people pleasing and start like self pleasing, we got to look at how other people were benefiting from us not taking care of ourselves to now we are, and we got to deal with the changes that come with that. Can you speak to that as best you can, and then I'll like narrate it or condense it accordingly?
Yeah. Again, I think our what we are taught, like how we are socialized, is to sacrifice ourselves in a lot of ways for the benefit or the betterment of others, particularly people that we love. Um, and I think, when you're confronted with that situation, you kind of have to have the I'm forgetting the word right now, but you got to be able to recognize that it's happening when it's happening. You know what I'm saying? That's kind of the first thing. Um, and then sort of do a kind of a cost benefit analysis almost be like, okay, how is this going to benefit me? How is this not going to benefit me? If I stay in this relationship, if I continue to engage this person a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, how is this going to benefit my life? Is this going to make things better? Is it going to make things worse? If I stay with this partner that I had, am I going to fuck my kids up 5 years down the line, by having them live in an unhappy house, as opposed to like separating and maybe putting us both in positions where we can all be better for ourselves. Like you have to sort of think long tail, um, and don't make immediate judgments. Like actually, give thought to what the best case scenario in these things might be.
Man, as you said that, I think about like how a lot of men do information. I do this thing where I go, worst case scenario, this happens. And it's so much easier for me to go there. And I don't know if this is a collective experience, but me and my friends, we definitely do that shit where we're like, oh, what's the worst that could happen? This. And this kind of thinking is like when you say like my people, they like, what happens if I don't do this? That is what comes to mind. What happens if I don't take care of myself? And when I start there, it's easier for me to identify the possibilities of what can happen if I do prioritize my own self-care, if I do take care of myself. And there's a fear for me, and I don't know if this is something you can speak to from your experience of having more of these conversations, but I think about like even my comfort zone or what I've gotten out of not taking care of myself from the people around me. Is there a way that we can challenge what those fears are, what those beliefs are, so that we can get to a place of seeing the importance of taking care of ourselves?
I think sometimes it's as simple as just changing the worst case scenario to a best case scenario in your head. I mean, just to give you an example, I'm 48 years old. I grew up in Brooklyn in the 1980s. Not,
Bro, you
you
don't
know,
look, hey, you don't look 48.
we, we don't we crack internally, we don't crack externally. Um, but New York City in the 1980s and 90s was not nice, right? Like it was definitely like not a great place to be in. And I grew up with the mindset that like worst case scenario was always going to happen, was always going to happen, was always going to happen. And I remember talking to my therapist like right around the time I was maybe like 39. And he was like, what did you think your life was going to be like when you turn 40? And I was like, I didn't think I was going to turn 40. So I didn't really prepare for this. Like this is all kind of a surprise now. Um, and it was because I had that worst case scenario mindset. I was socialized into that worst case scenario mindset. Growing up in an impoverished condition, growing up, poor, being a black kid in the hood, being, whatever, all of this stuff. And I think about it and I'm like, man, I'm still here. Like, I didn't call it, but maybe had I called it way back when I was calling the opposite, I would have been better prepared to like, appreciate and live a different life in my middle age.
Man, and what were the people around you like? What were their influences on you for you to go from like, oh, for you to have the thought process of, oh, I ain't really see myself making it past, what'd you say, 39, 40, right? Like, what was my
Yeah.
life gonna like? I didn't see this coming. Like, what did you see your life as, from that point, I guess, of when you recognize, I guess, I don't know if this might have been something that happened for you in early adulthood or what, but it took me till I was probably 26 before I had like a life awakening event of what the fuck am I doing? Right.
Yeah.
And even I've had more since then, but I guess I'm curious, like, what kind of friends or environments did you have that contributed to like you being able to change from that, I guess, worst case scenario of like I didn't expect myself to turn 40. Like, as seemingly on the surface dark as that might be, that's our norm, right?
It is our norm, and I don't think a lot of people are able to like verbalize that or maybe consciously realize that, but that is the norm for so many people, particularly I think people, that come from our age range, um, where like the idea of getting old was just like, what? Like, I don't know about that. But we're here. And a lot of people, you can see that a lot of people didn't think long term and they didn't play the long game because there are so many of us passing away in like our 40s and 50s from preventable things.
And that's what we talked about with Dr. Roderick here, like the first conversation we had. Like, we're talking about things that take 20, 30 years to cultivate: diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, right? These things, especially among Black men.
Hmm.
And when this is what we're just seeing around us, like, I had an uncle pass away. He had prostate cancer and then he died of COVID. In 2020, 2021. I've seen like my grandmother, she passed away from a heart condition when I was 13, 12, 13 years old. And I just look at, I don't see a lot of old men. My great grandmother's outlived all her husbands. I can't tell you how many years. So the this kind of ties too into the stress and what kind of environments we grow up in, what we learn from those environments, the people who are older than us having like the mindsets of those things as well. And for me to have come to a place of even wanting to hold and create a space to have these conversations, this is something I never saw myself being able to do.
Right.
And you and I spoke about like identities as well. Me being a cisgendered heterosexual Black man, and did you say you're queer or gay man? Which one did
Queer.
you? Okay,
I
as a
prefer. Yeah, I mean, you call it whatever. Sexuality is a spectrum, is fluid. Like,
mm,
queer is probably most appropriate.
okay, so cisgendered heterosexual man and a queer man, Black man too, like being able to facilitate and have just like a real conversation. I don't think this is something that people get to see. And I think that as I've seen it growing up, it was like if you didn't like women, like you were completely just othered. And I think that I've probably learned a lot more about even my heterosexuality, we could say, from having conversations with queer people or queer men, or being in more spaces where it's okay for you to just be as you are. Like, I'm not looking at you from a sexual standpoint or like what you're doing. And what I'm transitioning to here at this point is this idea of masculinity, right? So masculinity has often been something that's been associated with being a man, and being a man being associated with not being a woman, right? So, in the concept of masculinity as it relates to being a man, would you say that you've experienced or seen any differences between masculinity as a straight man and masculinity as a queer man? Are there any differences or major similarities that we can speak to?
At the end of the day, I want to say there really aren't. Um, I play acted as a straight person for, the first 30 years of my life. So I had that experience. And also, when I'm out in public, I'm presumed to be straight. Like I don't. in most cases, I don't really wear my sexuality on my sleeve. I don't think there's anything wrong with wearing it on your sleeve, but that's just kind of not the way that I rock. Um, and it's funny because, like you said, that these are uncommon conversations, but the reality is that we don't know the sexual orientation of every person that we're speaking to. Actually, we don't know the sexual orientation of anybody that we're speaking to, because God knows there are a lot of people that I've encountered in my life who will say to your face they're straight and then in private not be. So the reality is that you don't know what anyone's sexual orientation is. And you know, if it's the Kinsey scale. If straight is here and gay is here, the majority of people are somewhere in here. And that fluctuates and floats or whatever it is. So you are very likely having conversations with men, with non-heterosexual men on a very regular basis. You just don't know it. Um, so to go back to the question you asked, um, I think there is a premium on like quote unquote traditional masculinity uh in you know no matter what the orientation is of the people who are having the conversation. um and I don't necessarily see queer men looking at that necessarily from a different lens as straight men are. And also, like, there is one kind of misinterpretation or misnomer that I want to get out of the way that kind of bothers me a little bit, is that there are still a lot of people out there, and my family is guilty of this. I know a lot of older people who are guilty of this, who think that because a man is not heterosexual, it means that he wants to be a woman. And like, I can only speak for myself. I've never had any gender dysphoria. I've never wanted to be a woman. I've never not wanted to be a man. Like, you can one doesn't necessarily equal the other. But I do think, and I come from a West Indian background, and anti-man is a word that a lot of people in the West Indian community use to describe homosexual men in particular. Um, but that's not what it is. I mean, while there are certainly queer men who are much more fluid in terms of their gender and gender presentation, there are also a lot of queer men who have no issues with their male gender at all.
Yeah. Okay. So as we speak about masculinity presented in a heterosexual way or non-heterosexual way, let's just call it that,
Yeah,
right? I find that it's not gendered, right? Like there is no it's masculinity as a set of characteristics. But I do see in more heterosexual environments, people, spaces, that masculinity is more so defined as just not femininity. Whereas when I see masculinity spoken to from a lens of vulnerability, it has a completely different expression that feels more like in its root. And we look at things like playing sports, oh, masculine, or that's manly, or driving fast, like doing in extremes, I guess, is probably the most simplistic way I can put as being masculine. But when we look at that masculinity in that sense, it's just like not feminine, not soft, not pretty, not like that's how it's talked about. But as I look at masculinity through a lens of vulnerability, and this is where like the depth of our conversation really is, it's something more. It's, to me at least, being able to not just recognize and exert like your strengths, not overcompensating. It's not something that's immature. I'm doing a lot of this thing that I hate when people do this, where you're like, it's not this, not, because that takes you into so many directions to identify what it is. So I want to say that the most vulnerable expressions of masculinity oftentimes look like acknowledging and leaning into weaknesses, insecurities, and those things that maybe inherently aren't masculine, that might be more associated with femininity, and then being able to speak to those from a place of like confidence, right? Like I think about talking about emotions. It's not masculine to talk about emotions because that's a feminine thing, but vulnerability kind of bypasses that shit. And being able to talk about your emotions does this thing where it almost more so affirms your identity beyond masculinity. And so as I like, there's not really a question here. This is just more of like a transition into discussion about the vulnerable expressions of masculinity and what we can see be born out of that. So over the 5 years of conversations, right? We're talking about the Detoxicity podcast. We're talking about like masculinity conversations. I imagine there have been some very vulnerable conversations there as well. So, how can we encourage more men to be vulnerable? If there's a question, that's the question. But if you got anything else to add about your own views on masculinity through a lens of vulnerability, please.
Yeah. I mean, I think that first of all, if you're gonna put yourself out there and be on a podcast that people are gonna listen to and talk about real shit, there's an expectation that there's going to be some level of vulnerability. Like, you can't get on camera and then just stop talking because then there's not going to be any content for anybody to consume. And I'm gonna ask the questions anyway. So, I'm a walk with you, but you got to put yourself out there. Um, I think vulnerability is not just the key to living a full life, no matter what gender you are. Um, I think it helps your relationships being vulnerable. I think questioning yourself is always a good thing because you don't lead yourself to better things unless you question yourself, and that takes a little bit of vulnerability. Um, and it's not weakness. Like saying I don't know or I'm gonna check on this or I'm not sure is not weakness. Um, it is, we don't know everything. The world changes constantly around us. So many of these concepts are also like subjective and not objective. There's no rule for what masculine is. Masculine is whatever it means to you. It's like blackness. That is whatever that means to you. Like the blackness you experience is probably different from the blackness I experience as, a child of immigrants, as somebody in the queer community, as someone who's a little older, like whatever it is. And all of these experiences are valid. Like there's no saying that you're not a man because you do this, that, and the other thing, because the way that I experience masculinity and the way that you experience masculinity can be two very different things.
Yeah, and there's so many different experiences of that. And I even think when you say like the way we experience blackness, right? Like I remember growing up and being super dark skinned. It was a dude darker than me on the block, and they called me Bernie Mac, Wesley Snipes, right? And I'm like, you blacker than I am, right? And so that kind of blackness, the experience of having dark skin, the experience of being into things that you're not supposed to be into. And I look at this, from the media perspective, we see a lot of the role models that I had. Like, I didn't see a fucking sex educator, podcaster, anything like what I'm doing right now, yoga instructor for sure. I didn't see any of that that looked like me. And so,
Man,
as I go ahead.
I mean, it's crazy, right? Because even I'm like when you were talking, I was thinking about every time I've tried to look for a therapist, and there is like for every 20 like white women therapists, there might be one man of color who's a therapist. And that might be actually generous. It might even be less.
So the Therapy Fund Foundation came on and actually said that there were, I think she said 4%. 4%. What she say? Did she comment? Oh, I thought that I thought somebody just posted in chat, but like it's less than 4% of the therapists that are out there are of color.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So we need to be more in these wellness spaces.
Yeah. Um, I don't know if you heard me, but yeah, Christian just commented 4.1%.
One,
Um, yeah, like in the experience that I had, like I was supposed to play sports, be an actor, be a rapper, or and I don't want to say like be a gangbang. We didn't really have like gangs around me necessarily. We just had people who's doing shit that wasn't legal, I would say.
right?
And those were the options that were like in my face. I wish that I saw all of these other career paths and opportunities. Like I have a job teaching medical students to give general exams that pays me $400 a day for like 4 hours of work. All I gotta do is get there. And it's not every day. If it was, that'd be cool. But there's that. There's running nonprofits. There's doing things like this. Like I'm able to create spaces and events that not only are helping me with survival needs, but also allowing for me to be able to create community in order for me to establish and like support having some type of an impact, and just encouraging people by giving them a blueprint of, hey, here's how we can have some real conversations, right? And here's what expressions of vulnerability look like. So yeah, and this is why I'm excited. I'm grateful for all of the conversations that we've been able to have on here, and to bring you on to dive a little bit more deep into vulnerability as it
Yeah.
relates to me, as just referencing the koshas or the five sheets. This is the wisdom body. As we talk about the wisdom body, this is where vulnerability, I believe, comes in, because this is where our mask is off, and this is where we are who we are in this layer of the self. And so I'm gonna ask, man, what does vulnerability mean to you?
There's something that I tell myself a lot. And it's this quote has been used so many times. And I remember it being like even like a song when I was a little kid. Teddy Pendergrass had a song called "You Can't." It's either you can't hide from yourself, or you can't run from yourself, because no matter where you look, there you are. And I think what vulnerability is going to that person that you are and actually not running, confronting that person, like being walking with that person. You talk about authenticity, you talk about, being your best self, like all of these Oprah quotes that are like in the air. Um, and what vulnerability really is like, the Mike, or whatever, the Courtney, whoever you're presenting externally, and the person you are internally kind of speaking to each other, and having like an honest and open conversation with each other, and then presenting that to the world externally.
Wow. So I happen to be I happen to be one of the few people who found a black therapist out there, black guy. Happen to also be from my hometown. He's a gay black man who has HIV and he has herpes. And so for myself, being a black man, for me to have found a therapist who also just so happened to have herpes, right? Like this was less than 4.1% chance, and then even less than that for him being someone who has herpes, and then even less than that for him being someone who would, as a therapist, tell me that he has herpes.
Right.
But I read this because he challenged me and he called me out one day. He said he was speaking to me about this need to be vulnerable, or he was like, "Hey, black men need you to be vulnerable. You're not being vulnerable." I was like, "What the fuck are you talking about? Talk about having herpes. How much more vulnerable can you get?" And I speak to like performative vulnerability because I think that it may not have been performative at the time. Maybe I actually thought I was being vulnerable because that was just what I had to work with. But I think about now how this is so much more vulnerable for me than talking about herpes, perhaps because it's practiced, I've had time with it, I've had experience with it. It could be that, or it could be what you just explained, like meeting myself where myself is as myself and being able to like not run. I coming into this symposium, like I think that there's topics, there's conversations that like, you know, this ain't something black people do, that's white people shit, or being able to like facilitate conversations that I want to be having. I think with that, there's been a fear because I was thinking about like sending y'all money and telling everybody like, hey, like I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. This ain't my wheelhouse. And vulnerable moments. So that uh vulnerability masculinity event that I was going to do in Brooklyn with Lola, we didn't have anybody register, and I was having like some intense ass imposter syndrome.
Drum.
like, well, I don't talk about this. I talk about herpes, and that's what people know me as. Even if I have like these discussions behind the scenes or one on one, or like they're the undercurrent of my herpes podcast, it's it's not really like something that people know me for. So I guess I got this fear of like being told to stay in my lane, or there's other people who've been doing this way longer. And like even talking about this now, like I can point out that I feel like in my chest that this is something that feels like that, meeting myself where I'm at. Because I had to like, I ain't gonna say I had to hype myself up. I had to get through those moments of discomfort before we got here to the day. I came in, I did the yoga, and I was like, man, you know what? I'm gonna do this.
I'm ready to do this. Yeah.
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 So that to me, here we are like 2, 3 years later since he said that, has been more vulnerable than me doing what other people view as vulnerable. And so I want to ask you too, like, what's a vulnerable moment in your life where you thought you were being vulnerable, but you learned that you actually weren't? If you can recall something like that.
Um, I'm sure that it is something that I still do probably on a regular basis. Um, Particularly again as things like vulnerability and authenticity become more like buzzwordy kind of things. Um, but I'm thinking about what you said, and I like objectively, I want to be like, okay, take those thoughts of imposter syndrome and like dead that because everybody's qualified. If you have an opinion about something, you're qualified to speak on it, blah blah blah. Subjectively, I'm like, well, shit, I have imposter syndrome all the fucking time. Um, and it's it's coming from a protective place, but it's also like you can't listen to it. And I think the reason that I listen to it less now is because I've understood, or I've come to understand how important modeling behavior is. Like putting yourself out here and talking to these like 20, 24, however many people, like you've just had an impact on all of the people that are in this chat right now. You know what I'm saying? And the person that would have had the imposter syndrome and been like, I'm not going to do this, then you don't affect one person. You know what I'm saying? Um, and there are plenty of things that I've done over the course of my life, whether it's been talking about my struggles with like depression, or talking about my sexuality, or talking about whatever, where there's been like one person that's reached out to me afterwards and been like, yo, Mike, thank you for talking about this. I'm a go see a therapist. I'm gonna like blah blah blah. I'm gonna do whatever. And I'm like, if I can share my stuff with people and one person, like the light turns off one person, then I did my job. It's worth it. And you don't have to be an expert on anything to affect someone in that way. And particularly for us, and going back to there's not a lot of us in these spaces, like our words can be so powerful because it's not even necessarily what you're saying, it's the identification of seeing somebody that looks like you that can make the difference there. So imposter syndrome is the devil. Don't listen to it.
Yeah. And I wonder too, man, like sometimes is that voice ever really there to protect us? I can't think of a time where I listened to that voice and didn't have regrets. But every time I've heard that voice and didn't listen to it, I think that that's where I found myself like excited or like, damn, you know what? I'm glad I did that thing.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've come to realize in life as well is I would rather look back on the situation and go, why didn't I do it this way? Than look back and be like, why didn't I do anything and take any kind of action?
Full circle, worst case scenario versus best case scenario.
There it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, all right. So what are some ways like if we can speak to I think that vulnerability is a practice. And that's very unfortunate because we accumulate over time like a mask, or we have like our ego, we've got all of this like accumulation of just like personality or experiences that we feel like maybe we got to mask up, layer up, put on this armor and go out into the world only to learn we got to take this shit off. What do we know, or what do you think is a way that we can practice vulnerability in a way that does, in fact, feel safe for us, in a way that we can get better at it?
I think it starts with mindfulness. Um, when you're in situations where you are, for example, if you're talking to somebody and you're having a conversation and your first impulse is to say some bullshit to protect yourself. Like before you open your mouth to talk, think about that. And, maybe your response might be a little slower, but think about like, what am I about to say versus what do I mean to say? What is this person asking me? How do I feel about what this person's asking me? It's like, kind of being a little bit more internal minded. I think mindfulness is super, super important. You can practice with yourself before you go out in the world and and practice that with other people. I think that vulnerability is scary because we all want to be liked, we all want to be appreciated, we all want to be respected, and if we put our truest selves out there, we run the risk of being criticized or being rejected, or again, we're thinking worst case scenario. um and uh, I try to be as vulnerable and authentic as I can be at any given time. And it's fucked up some relationships. I've lost some people, you know, but I've also gotten a lot of new people. And the people that stuck around, like I know that they're ride or die people because they know me like 100% for me. And nothing's gonna come out 3 years from now, 5 years from now that'll make them be like, well, damn, I was friends with Mike, or I was in a relationship with Mike all this time, and he didn't share this with me. Um, and there is I think about when I came out, and it was such a relief to not have this shit on my shoulder anymore and have to like think about stories to tell people or lies that I was telling people or like whatever. Like I could be more in the moment talking to people because I wasn't thinking about how to like cover my tracks up. And I think that relaxation, that relief is so, so important. And that comes from, again, authenticity and vulnerability, like putting yourself out there.
Your shirt say heavy on the, what they say, protecting on my
Heavy on
peace.
the protect your peace. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. Now, when you talk about coming out, right, using that as an example of vulnerability and feeling better, I imagine that there was just like a weight on you in that. Is there a time where you came out to someone? You said people like disappeared and others got closer, right? Like, I'm going to use this example to ask my question. But I find that for men, it's generally very difficult, partially because it's not modeled for us to be able to open up about our emotions, our feelings. Because oftentimes, when men do finally, after all that pressure and build up, like say what the feelings are, a lot of times people don't know what to do with that.
Right.
And the people who don't know what to do with that, you have the power to encourage that man to do more of that and do the work around that, or make them go, I'm never doing that shit again. And then we have the repressed emotions that lead to a lot of unconscious and harmful behavior that ultimately our partners, our family, our friends, our jobs have to deal with. So, is there anything that you have to say that you could speak on about like your experience with coming off and it being received well versus not well, or any other vulnerable moments where it was received well or not well?
I mean, I think I've been in a lot of situations where I've had to express something about myself that I knew that some people weren't necessarily going to be on board with. And I think I've been pleasantly surprised more than I've not been pleasantly surprised. Um, I think some people are just relieved that you're being honest with them and that you're able to get like the burden off your shoulders. And I mean, the way I look at it is if someone can't handle it, then that's on them and that's not on me. Like I'm just being me. If you can't handle me, then that's your problem and not my problem,
Yeah.
you know? And I think you have to value yourself enough to know that if you're expressing vulnerability, no matter what it is, like if you know, If you're unsure about something, you want to ask a question. If you haven't been feeling well, you want to go to a doctor. Like, and someone has an issue with that, then that issue is their issue. It is not your issue.
Hmm. Damn. And what does it take to get to that place? Because we also care a lot about what other people think, even people who say they don't care about what other people be
Yeah,
thinking. Like, do you just get there with practice? Does it take time? Does it take like a big experience to happen or what?
I think it's practice, but I also think it's like valuing yourself. Like, if a meteor hit the earth and everybody was gone except for me, like I got to be here by myself. So I got to like myself enough to like present myself to other people, you know? And it goes again, like going back to the selfish thing. It's like you have to be confident in yourself. And you have to feel that you're, you know, good enough person, whatever the fuck that means. Um, that you're gonna be okay whether certain people rock with you and certain people don't. There's never not going to be somebody who's in your corner. Um, so maybe there'll be less people and you have to hold those people closer, hold them tighter. But you know, I think it's so important to just put yourself out there, like emotionally speaking. Again, also like talking about relationships, like you can't be in relationship with another person, a real relationship, a valuable relationship, unless y'all know each other for who y'all really are. Like if y'all are do if y'all aren't vulnerable with each other, you don't know who you really are, then y'all are just play acting a relationship. Y'all aren't really in a relationship. Y'all are
Yeah.
pretending.
Yeah, it's like two people's masks are
Mm.
in a relationship with each other. And
Right.
always think like time, life experiences do this thing where we're at a crossroads of a decision. And I guess the Matrix is a real good example of that. Hey, you're at this crossroads. You can keep doing what you've been doing, or you can like accept this reality and have to make changes. And I don't know that a lot of us really have the opportunity to meet a person exactly where they are. And I know Day talked about this with earlier uncoupling from his wife and then getting back together. So it was like the masks might have been cracking around the same time, and then for them to authentically be able to reconnect. I don't know that a lot of us really have the opportunity to have our masks coming off and then we be surrounded by other people whose masks are off as well. And I think that this kind of speaks to the importance of creating community or finding and having community where that's the norm.
Yeah, 100%. I if there's a word that I've used more in the past 12 months than any other is community. Like community is going to, save or doom us all. Like we're not particularly, the way the world is, becoming nowadays, like we need community more than ever.
Yeah. And when we talk about community, right, like there's this aspect of enabling and there's this aspect of accountability, and we kind of have these echo chambers of social media where our belief systems are just like echoed back to us to
Hmm.
a point where anything under this umbrella of thought is all there is. Anything that maybe challenges that or is not that is like the enemy, I want to say. And I'm finding that it's very much more vulnerable too for us to have differing opinions or belief systems or like even different facts to present and be able to bring to another person and have like a healthy debate about it. So when we find ourselves in these spaces, like our vulnerability is coming out and it's not met, how we would like for it to be met. What are some ways that we can either meet people where they are, or do we even want to? Do we even want to meet people where they are when our mask comes off? Because I kind of gotten to a point myself where like I don't want to put my mask back on.
Right, right. There's, and I'm gonna fuck it up. There's a James Baldwin quote about basically meeting people where they are, unless where that person is. takes away your humanity, right? Like if you are homophobic, transphobic, if you are racist, if you are misogynist, like I'm not gonna fuck with you. That's just, I can't have a civil conversation with you because what you stand on is 100% against what I stand on. Everybody else, like if you're willing to listen, then I'm willing to have a conversation with you. And I think there are certain situations where you have to draw that line in the sand, but in most other situations, like you can find some common ground. And I think that requires having a little bit of empathy, um, and realizing that your experience is not everybody else's experience. Your experience is not anybody else's experience. Your experience as Courtney is 100% unique to you being Courtney. My experience as Mike is 100% unique to me being Mike. Now we're going to have some commonalities, but you know, we're also going to have things where we are not necessarily in alignment, and we have to take those masks off and communicate honestly and respectfully in order to like make that work.
Yeah.
But it really requires, again, it requires communication, which I think a lot of people are bad at nowadays. And it requires empathy. And like, I don't know how you get empathy. Um, I think, a lot of Black folks are predisposed to being empathetic because, you know, you look, this country was not made for us. Like, you have to know how the power structure works in order to succeed within the power structure. So, like, I participate in white society every day. I know what it's like to be white. Even though I'm Black, they don't know what it's like to be Black necessarily. Um, but the empathy is sort of being able to see the world through other people's experiences. And I think that, if you lean into the diversity of it all, like you can actually access what it might be like to go through life as a different type of person. And that leads to, you know, more involved conversations, more communications that come from the heart, more vulnerable communications, more open, more honest communications, and, better community, better friendships, better relationships, so on. Whoop, you're muted, Courtney.
I thought I unmuted. I was about to spit like a preacher. All right, now there is a line for sure. And I know you said like there's just some people all right, this I'm not doing this.
Right.
And I wonder if people struggle with not necessarily trying to change somebody's opinion or their mind or their views or beliefs, but even just in an attempt to understand, right? Like if someone, what are some examples? Like I think that we see social media operating these two extremes. Okay. On this side, there's the most extreme and loud people. And then on this side, there's the most extreme and loud people. I think most people are fairly reasonable and just don't have all the information or as much of the information as they do. They're on this side because they see that that side is only yelling about this and vice versa. And I'm wondering, where's the line for a person? Like, I value myself as someone who likes to see all sides before making any decision on action, but also wanting to give everyone like all of the information, all of the perspectives, or just what makes sense to get so that then everyone has like the information and isn't just exclusively looking at things from one lens. Um, I know we talk about like taking care of yourself, right? That shit can get draining trying to like
Mhm.
joke, be the peacekeeper and all of that. So at what point do we just say fuck it and give up versus like wanting to create change? Because I can see that there are so many people who want change but maybe go about it the wrong way, or they burn themselves out trying to beat a dead horse, convincing somebody who's way over on this side that hey, you need to be way over on this side rather than meeting people where they at.
I think that's different for every person that you ask. We weren't all built with the same bandwidth. And I think some people are better equipped to have conversations that may be a little bit more difficult, or with people that may be a little bit more difficult than others. Like, my fuse is short. I don't know that I can sit and have a pleasant conversation with somebody who is not in favor of me having humanity. But, I did a podcast episode maybe a year ago with a trans person, and they were like, I actually like having conversations with people who like don't, who don't think that I deserve to exist because, I can change their minds just by sitting there and having a conversation with them. And I respect that and I appreciate that. And I think we do need to have people like that in the world because that is how minds get changed. But some people don't have time for that. And you got to respect that too. And you just got to know what your internal compass is. And how much bullshit you are willing to handle while still keeping your peace.
Yeah. Woo. Now, I wrote here in our notes, there was one thing that I wanted to like really dive into. Um, Looking at, and we kind of touched on masculinity, we touched on vulnerability, but I guess like the expectations of it, right? So we're here, we're talking about like black men's emotional wellness, and we got to be able to speak to how different black masculinity is as opposed to the general view of masculinity. Do you have anything to say about that? Just if you've had conversations that you can reference where there are key differences between black masculinity and white masculinity.
I mean, I think about my black friends and my white friends. I think about the friends that I grew up with, particularly in my family, versus the friends that I have now, which are, pretty extremely different groups of people. Um, and, I think traditional socialized black masculinity, um, and I'm trying to choose my words carefully here. Um, it's just this, you know, impenetrable, like thing that is almost like there is value in protecting your family. There's value in protecting the people that you love. There's value in mental strength. There's value in physical strength. Um, there is not value in misogyny, and that's not certainly not exclusive to black and brown people. Like, men across the board. I mean, people, because women can be misogynist and chauvinist too. People across the board are misogynist. That doesn't necessarily have a qualifier that's related to race. Um, the need for the lack of vulnerability, I think, is kind of what sticks out the most. Like the lack of vulnerability and almost the mocking of people who are vulnerable or who might think differently or whatever. um and like you can go back and trace, like, that shit comes straight from fucking slavery. That shit comes straight from fucking slavery. And if we sat and like thought about that shit and like, why do I think this way, like, you could literally trace that shit back. And I really wish that we listen to one another. um we respected one another a little bit more. We put, we accepted the different images of masculinity out there. Like I had, just like on a tangent, I had a whole conversation like either holidays last year or the year before about Russell Westbrook wearing a skirt and why that didn't mean he was gay to my black ass family, and they weren't getting it. I was just like, okay, I'm done. um but we need to have more conversations about why this like impenetrable wall is up and why it needs to be broken down. And again, it goes back to like being vulnerable, being open, saying I don't know. Like all this stuff doesn't make you any less of a man.
Man,
Um,
I used to get in so much trouble for saying I don't know.
I don't know. Same, same, same.
uh and I guess that is vulnerable. Like even saying that, like it feels so strange, right, in my body, like, and I'm aware of it, right? But I can't go back now to not being able to name, uncomfortable things. Like one, it's not who I am anymore, and then the second thing too is like it's not who I want to be. I
Right,
don't want to go back to wearing a mask. I don't want to
right.
go back to not being vulnerable and having those like superficial relationships and conversations, man. So like when you say this shit comes from slavery, like I got chills down my body because we don't have vulnerability, especially as Black men. We're not really given permission or examples of what that looks like. And then when we are vulnerable, me and my friends, we made a joke about this, getting on a video game, and no, it was a meme we shared with each other. It was like a video playing Call of Duty, and one of the dudes got on, and like game times, like for the bros, and the dude got on. He was like, "Hey man, like I'm having a hard time. Like, I don't know. I think I might be depressed." One of the guys was like, "What's wrong, man?" And he started talking. He just like shitted on him, just started going off. And it's like that's that like the mocking of the
Yeah,
vulnerability. Like, oh, you sad, you and your feelings, shut the fuck up and get some kills. Right. And then that's what we do. We like push that shit down, and our mask gets a little bit thicker and tougher for us to crack, and we just go about day-to-day life, not able to be vulnerable, not able to have the expression of this thing that's bubbling up in us. That's just like fucking wanting to be seen.
right. In that conversation, I feel for the person that got clowned, that got shitted on, but I also feel for the person that did the shitting on, because who hurt that person?
How uncomfortable do you have to be to tell somebody like, and these are like extreme cases I'm saying, but like they're in my point of reference, but like
Right.
someone who is talking about being depressed, especially the way that we now understand depression to be what it is, right? For you to be able to clown that person or bully them, it's like just like with bullies, right? Like
Yeah.
you of course have empathy for the person that's being bullied, but now understanding like, damn, that's a sign of something happening at home that this person has absolutely no control over.
He just
And
told on himself.
yes, yes. And I wish I had this awareness, this knowledge, this education, this vulnerability, empathy back then to have been able to, I ain't gonna say give them a hug, but just be able to behave differently, because that's something that I think has stuck with me. Like I lose my shit. There's like one thing that makes me lose my shit, and it's someone causing like physical harm to someone who is unable to defend
Defend
themselves.
themselves.
Yeah, like I get enraged. Like somebody stole a package yesterday. I was mad, but I like, you really want to see me pissed? Like have that happen in front of me. Like and what this does, like I remember this kid, he was 12 and he hit my little sister and she was like 10. I was about to fight this dude, mama, three of his brothers, everybody. It's like, no, you don't hit my little sister. And this kind of goes back to we were talking about like masculinity earlier. Like, yes, it can exert, violence. This is what Anthony had talked about at one point, but it can do that violence. And that little boy having three older brothers who I ain't gonna say I don't think I was gonna win this fight, but I was ready
Sure.
because that's my sister, right? And so it kind of makes the impossible possible, and it is protective, it is defensive, and I don't know that I really had like any type of containment or a container for the expression of like those emotions. And I see vulnerability as like emotions that we really don't know what to do with, and
Do
maybe
it.
it comes out in some words. Maybe it comes out as asking for help. Maybe it comes out as starting a nonprofit organization for people with herpes, right? Like we
Right.
just don't know. Uh, so I say all of that to just say, man, like this space is important to me. The way that, for you to have been doing this for 5 years, like I'm on like June, July, August, September, October, November. I'm on like 6 months and just having a conversation.
Yeah.
So I really do appreciate you being here. And I just want to like close out and wrap up. First off, with is there anything like pressing for you that you really want to speak to that we can touch on before we transition out of here? I know I told y'all we about 15 minutes behind on
Minutes,
the show.
yeah. No, man, I just appreciate like you holding this container for people and even like doing this. When I was, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, as a black man, for there to be a space where I could connect with other black men and speak about things vulnerably, like that wouldn't have even been in like my thought process. I appreciate you having this space, and hopefully this models behavior for other people to create their own spaces to do this exact same thing, and it like grows and grows and grows and grows exponentially. So, I just appreciate you being an open person and being vulnerable yourself, and holding the space.
Appreciate that, man.
Yeah.
All right, being mindful of all y'all's time
Time.
might also let you go ahead and let people know how they can connect with you, how they can find the podcast as well, please.
Yeah, so the podcast is called Detoxicity, is on every podcast platform you could think of. So, whatever podcast platform you use, uh, type Detoxicity and you'll find me. I am on Instagram at DetoxPodGuy. So that's DetoxPodguy. And my coaching website is mike-joseph.com. Um,
I
I think
forgot I
that's it.
forgot to ask you,
Oh,
we were supposed to talk about joy a little bit.
oh,
We got into the vulnerability. Like
it's all right.
yeah. So like I find that as we do more of this, like speaking about vulnerability, like there's a lot of joy in this because to me, like it's connecting, right?
Hmm.
Realness, the presence, the connection, that is very much important to me. So I want to ask you, like, what brings you joy? How'd you come to find that for yourself?
Man, there are lots of things that bring me joy. Basketball brings me joy. Music brings me joy.
Watching or playing.
I'm old. I can't really play that much anymore, so it's watching more than playing. As sad as that makes me to say, music brings me joy. My people bring me joy more than anything else. Like, and I'm trying to lean real hard into that. With the uncertainty of the world right now, just lean into the other humans that make me feel good, and spend time with them and enjoy them and love on them. Community, community, community. But I think it's really important, particularly in dark times, to find the things that bring you joy and like lean as hard into them as you possibly can.
Thank you, man. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll go ahead and let you go. I'm gonna wrap
Thank
us
you.
up. And
Appreciate that, Courtney.
yes, yes. And we'll be in touch. We'll be in touch.
Yes, sir.
All right.
All right.
Let oh, I got to close out the recording. All right, y'all. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you're watching this or listening to or watching it later, thank you. I have feedback forms that I hope everybody got in the original email. It would really mean a lot to myself and Black Men's Wellness for us to get some of that information from y'all just about how we can better serve and support and challenge and celebrate the Black men around us, whether you are a Black man or you are someone who is connected to a Black man. I know we got a couple of the survey responses, but oh yeah, we did get a couple more. Cool. All right, I appreciate y'all. Yeah, please, if you can take that survey for us, that would mean a lot. I guess I should have stopped recording because this is irrelevant to people who are listening to this later. Thank y'all for tuning in and stop recording.